Our assigned lectionary text for this morning comes from the book of Deuteronomy in the Hebrew scriptures, or what some also call the Old Testament. It's set in the time of Moses and cast as Moses's farewell speech. At this point in the larger narrative, in the larger story of the Israelites have gone through the Exodus and they've been liberated from Egypt and come through the Red Sea. They're about to, through pretty problematic means, take possession of the land promised to them by God. The text that we have this morning is about the covenant or the promise between God and Israel and the laws necessary for the Israelites to remain in that land. In other words, God is saying, I am your God, you are my people, this is your land. But in order to stay here, this is what you need to do. And the central command here is to love God with all their heart, soul, and might. So that's a little bit of background on where this text is coming from. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 to 9. Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the ordinances that the Lord your God charged me to teach you and to observe in the land you are about to cross into and occupy, so that you and your children and your children's children may fear the Lord your God all the days of your life, and keep God's decrees and commandments that I am commanding you, so that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and observe them diligently, so that it may go well with you, and so that you may multiply greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has promised you. And this next part is known as the Shema in our text. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children, and talk about them when you're at home and when you're away, when you lie down and when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. 7 of us walked through the door. Have you ever tattooed a bunch of church ladies? I asked the 2 burly and bearded guys in the Broken Clover tattoo parlor in Tucson, Arizona. A look of something like, you're pulling my leg with a little bit of fear crossed their faces. We were part of a group of 13 folks from this church that had gone to the borderlands south of Tucson, Arizona in 2019. Some of us who were there are in this room this morning. We went to encounter, learn, and witness to the profound tenacity and faith of travelers crossing through Central America, through the desert, and braving walls, border patrol vigilantes, extreme natural conditions, and phenomenally cruel immigration policies in order to seek out a better life for themselves and their children. We went to show solidarity, carry water, pray, and deepen our commitments. We each took a shell from the baptismal font here at church, and we left them in a variety of sacred places. Under a tree in the desert with a gallon of fresh water, at the courthouse after sitting through an Operation Streamline hearing in which dozens of travelers entered a courtroom shackled hand and foot and chained to one another. Under a section of razor wire wrapped around the rusted metal border wall. At the burial site of a traveler who died along the side of the road just hours before being transported to safety. Half of our group needed to head back, and 7 of us were able to stay a little longer, spending more time in the desert hauling water, meeting travelers. Sonia Saramonica and I had the honor of accompanying Jose and his 7-year-old son Miguel to the bus where they would travel to Oakland to stay while they awaited their asylum hearing. They had made it to Tucson, but it had been a perilous journey. They had traveled from a small village in Guatemala where their lives were in danger through conditions created in large part by our own country. They traveled across Central America and Mexico to the border on a massive freight train they call the Beast. With no money, Jose and his son had, along with hundreds of others, jumped the train. The boy was too small to travel on top of the cars like most of the others, so Jose had lashed his son with a belt to the steel railway car between the couplings, hoping he wouldn't get sucked down to the tracks below, and they traveled that way for 1,500 miles. We all of us saw so much, and on our last night in Arizona, the 7 of us that remained wanted to capture this experience in a way that would remind us of what we had witnessed and what our faith would call us to moving forward. So we decided to mark ourselves with words and symbols. 4 of us had the word justicia, which means justice in Spanish, and tattooed on our legs, reminding us to walk the walk of faith and pray with our feet. Justicia on our legs, and all 7 of us, words and symbols that reminded us of that time. Words have power. They can do violence, they can destroy, they can also hold and honor memories, create community, forge identity, and birth possibility. What words do you carry and hold in your heart? What words do you and what words do we as a community want to embody? What would it look like to emblazon, to tattoo our commitments on our skins, or write them on our hearts? Our text from Deuteronomy includes what is known as the Shema, which translated into English means hear, as in listen, hear. The Shema is probably the most central text in Jewish life. It's a call to attention, a commandment to listen, an affirmation of the oneness of God. It's a summary of the commandments and the central commitment to love the one who accompanied their beloved people from slavery to liberation in the Exodus from Egypt. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your might. Recitation of the Shema twice a day is a biblical commandment for Jews and is at the heart of daily morning and prayer services. For many Jews, these are the first words to be considered the moment that you awake, the last words to speak before you sleep, and the last words whispered before dying. For thousands of years, Jews have embodied these words not only through speaking, singing, praying, and chanting, but by fixing them on the doors of their homes in mezuzahs. A mezuzah is a small, beautiful case hung to the right side of a door as you enter a house. It contains a tiny scroll with the words of the Shema written on it. There's a mezuzah at the entrance of our sanctuary. It was a gift from our friends at Mishkan Shalom, a Jewish congregation that worshiped in our space for years. It was so powerful to share sacred space with this community and hold their Torah in their sanctuary. And they gifted us with several things, including that mezuzah, which is still there. Jews also wear the words of the Shema in tefillin, or phylacteries, the parchment inscribed with the verses from the Torah in little leather boxes with long straps that they wrap around their forehead or hand or arm. They literally wear these words on their bodies and write them on their homes. Many chant or sing these words to their children every night. The words of the Shema and the themes in Deuteronomy are an exercise in constructing identity. My friend and spiritual sister, Rabbi Malkabina Klein, testifies to this. She told me, living as a Jew in America, having words in our mouths helps us hold on to who we are. Grappling with the words of the Shema, taking them into her heart and spreading and passing them on to her children helps her continually connect and contribute to a vibrant religious culture and explore what it means to love God in the world. She, like so many others, sang these words to her child every single night. She said, to sing or speak these words is an act of love. Reciting the Shema for Rabbi Malkabina and others is an act of love for a child, using words from a sacred tradition that teaches them who they are and whose they are, especially in a world where their group identity is subject to marginalization and even violence. It's a way of loving a child. It's also an act of love for God, living into the covenant to love God with all one's heart, soul, and might. But that's where things get kind of interesting. Loving God for many Christians is an emotional thing. In much of my experience in other Christian circles and in much of Christian theology, that felt intense. I felt like I was being told that what God wanted from me was deep emotional love, something I should feel almost in the way that I would feel for somebody that I was madly in love with. And that somehow, if I wasn't feeling that love, I didn't have a strong faith. Or if I wasn't feeling that love, I didn't believe. So for a while I was pretty puzzled. Why was there so much emphasis on feeling all this love for God when in some of the spaces that I was in, we weren't talking about what was happening in the world around us? Loving God for me and many of the people that were around me was personal, individual. It was a sign of our devotion. But in Jewish tradition, loving God is more collective and embodied. We get a glimpse of this in the word soul in our text when it says, love God with all your soul. A little nerdy stuff in Greek interpretations of the Bible, we've received that word as something more akin to psyche. But the Hebrew word for soul here is nephesh, which translated means throat soul. Nephesh means throat soul. One Bible scholar explains this and says, when the Israelites spoke of the throat, they did not have so much the anatomical form of the larynx in mind as that the throat calls out, croaks, yodels, eagerly inhales air, hungrily and thirstily swallows nourishment and water. This concrete organ of the body was at the same time a symbol for a particular aspect of human life, namely the human being that has needs and desires and thirsts for life. So the throat was kind of a symbol or embodied what it meant to be human and to yearn and desire. It played a very important role, the craving, the yearning, the desiring. And in this Shema, this prayer offered to God, is about the inner capacity of people to feel and yearn for something different. So calling out, croaking, craving, such powerful images of throat soul, and an invitation to think about what it might mean to be people of God in a time like this. How do we leverage our nephesh, our throat souls, as we love in lament and joy and proclamation and liberation? How might we conspire? Conspire actually means to breathe with. How might we conspire in acknowledging and interrupting white dominant culture when it shows up? And what would it look like to really listen to the calls and cravings and yearnings of the children among us? How can we free our throat soul to grieve or cry or mourn? And how can we also express full-bodied throat soul joy, not because it's a form of resistance, but as Sonia Renee Taylor says, it just so happens that the more we're in our joy, the more disruptive it is to the system. For my friend Rabbi Malkabina, loving God doesn't just mean loving God. It means loving the oneness of God by loving the oneness of the world. She says, God is one, humanity is one, life is all one. So loving God means being in the ongoing process of learning to love all dimensions of life, even that which troubles us. I think so many others have gotten the message that in order to love God, we must separate ourselves from the world. It's a huge thing in white Protestant church traditions, and that combined with white dominant culture ends up sounding a lot like politics don't belong in church, social justice doesn't belong in church, and that we're just here to focus on God. And I know that that's not how so many people in this community feel, but it's very much a part of the dominant tradition outside and what informs all of the cultural conversations that are happening now. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with feeling deep and emotional love for God. And it's also okay if you don't feel it, or feel anything, or feel like you don't even believe in God. The cool thing about the Shema, this text that is so deeply sacred to Jewish people, is that it invites us to let go of a piety that focuses on loving God by separating ourselves from the world, and invites us to shift to embodying radical and fleshed love for the world. So even if we don't believe in God or feel love for God, we do that by loving the world. There are consequences to thinking that we can love God without loving the world, that we can be religious without helping to heal the world. Those consequences look like Flint, Michigan, looks like raging wildfires or COVID variants, the extinction of species every day, transphobia, police brutality, white supremacy. It looks like Jose having to lash his son to a speeding train with a belt, praying that he won't fall to the tracks below. It looks like Haitian refugees being swept up by the scores at the Rio Grande and put in shackles. What if God isn't a jealous deity that demands our obedience and our submission and our devotion and affection at all costs? But what if God is the oneness of creation that invites our solidarity with the world? And what if God is the breath of life seeking co-conspirators, co-breathers in the work of repair and healing and connection? What might it look like to love God by loving the world with all our heart and all our throat soul? What would it take to create and envision a future that's more just and has more space, more breath for all our bodies and all our yearnings? Maybe it looks like church ladies getting justicia tattooed on their legs, or a church putting banners in the front yard, not just to tell others that we believe Black Lives Matter, but because it helps us remember that we need to do something about it. Two of my spiritual guides in this time are Prentice Hemphill and Sonia Renee Taylor. I really recommend Taylor's book, The Body Is Not an Apology, and Prentice Hemphill's podcast, Finding Our Way. In one of their conversations, Sonia Renee Taylor asks this question. In a time of COVID and infection and mass transmission of pandemic and white supremacy that's spreading like virus and incendiary language in the media and social platforms, what do we want to be spreading? In a time of mass transmission and contagion, what do we want to be spreading? She says, we're in this moment of mass contagion, and we have some things that, should we be able to vision into them, we can spread, but in a totally different way. So the question is, what do we want to be spreading? Because we'll be spreading something. What do we want to spread? And how are we loving the oneness of God by loving the oneness of the world? What words do we want to embody and proclaim? What do we want to tattoo on our form and on our hearts and on our skins? And how can we love God with all our heart, all our throat soul, and all our might? In the poem Vahavta, Aurora Levens Morales, a Puerto Rican Jewish poet, writes about those words of the Shema and what we might think about our core commitments. She writes, say these words when you lie down and rise up, when you go out and when you return. In times of mourning and in times of joy, inscribe them on your doorposts, embroider them on your garments, tattoo them on your shoulders, teach them to your children, your neighbors, your enemies, recite them in your sleep. Here, in the cruel shadow of empire, another world is possible. This is God's good news. Amen.